Hi, I'm Aaron Ironside. Welcome to Active Intelligence, where we spend the next half an hour or so looking at social issues from a variety of perspectives. But let me start with the most important question of the day. Why did the chicken cross the road? I don't know. But one thing I do know is that the answer probably isn't that funny. Yet dad jokes aren't that funny, but we live in a world that's more concerned about the kinds of jokes that make people feel very upset. Could it be that those jokes should be considered hate speech? Doesn't sound very funny to me, as we take a look at that topic on today's episode. On today's episode, I catch up with one of the funniest men in Kiwi comedy, Brendhan Lovegrove, as we talk about whether or not a joke should be considered a hate crime. Is it in fact hate speech? It seems ridiculous, doesn't it, that something intended to make us chuckle could actually land you in jail. And if you think that I'm just talking hyperbolically, that this could never really happen in the real world, well, let's go to Scotland, where they've actually put in place some hate speech laws, and one boyfriend, well, he found himself on the wrong side of the law.
A Scottish court has just delivered a very clear message against hate speech and anti-Semitism. A man has just been convicted of a hate crime for teaching his girlfriend's dog how to perform a Nazi salute. Worst of all, the man actually filmed himself doing it and then uploaded it to YouTube, where the video immediately went viral. 29-year-old Mark Meechan can be seen in the video saying, quote, "My girlfriend is always ranting and raving about how cute and adorable her wee dog is, so I thought I would turn him into the least cute thing I could think of, which is a Nazi." This sets a very disturbing stage for the rest of the video, which has since been pulled off of the web by YouTube, in which the dog responds with a Nazi salute in response to Heil Hitler and commands to gas the Jews. Meechan claims he had no political motives behind this behavior and merely meant to annoy his girlfriend, but a Scottish judge has ruled that Meechan not only knew this was offensive, but also knew why it was offensive, and thus would have known that it would have been hurtful to many Jewish people. While freedom of expression was at play here, the court found Meechan guilty of a hate crime.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that it wasn't a very funny joke, and certainly we could see that it would be offensive. But the question is, should offence be a crime, given how easy it is to be offended in the world in which we live? And it turns out the most famous comics in the world tend to agree that a joke should not be a hate crime, even if it is a little bit offensive, as Ricky Gervais explains.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about offence, isn't it? When people say they're offended, it's that just because you're offended, it doesn't mean you're right, you know? It's... offence is about feelings, and feelings are personal. Some people are offended by equality. So what? You know, so you can't second-guess people. If you try and please everyone, you'll please no one. With comedy as well, I think you've got to deal with taboos and contentious issues, and sometimes you deal in irony, and some people don't get that, but, you know, you can't legislate against stupidity, otherwise you'll be doing nothing. So if you're saying anything, you should polarise. You should polarise, because everyone's different.
Well, it's not too often that I agree with Ricky Gervais, but on this point, of course, he's absolutely correct, that offence is so subjective, both in terms of what offends us, but also subjective in how intensely it offends us. I mean, I hear things all the time that I just shrug my shoulders and think, well, that's stupid. But that doesn't mean that I'm so violently offended that I feel that that person should, in fact, be arrested for saying such a thing. It's such an odd world in which we live that now a joke could be considered a crime. And on today's episode, I caught up with a man who's probably committed a few crimes over the years, according to that definition, Brendhan Lovegrove. We've known each other for over 25 years, although I can't say my comedy career is anywhere near as illustrious as today's guest. He has won multiple awards. He is an icon of the local comedy scene. Brendhan Lovegrove, nice to have you.
Thank you. It's a really nice way to be introduced. Thank you. I see myself as being forgotten somewhat over the last few years, but I appreciate what you're saying. That's very kind.
After over 25 years as a comedian, what would you have done if it hadn't worked out? What was plan B?
Well, funny enough, I have a joke about that because I have no plan B. I'm 49. It's too late to start a band. You know, I can't go to university. I was going to go to university when I was 19, but I thought before I do that, I'll have a gap life. And that's pretty much what I'm doing at the moment, having that gap life. And I'm coming to the end of it, I would imagine. But no, I don't know. I've often thought about that. I don't know what I would have done had I not done comedy 25 years ago, but I think now, if all of a sudden it came to a grinding halt, I'm quite interested in producing stuff and things like that. But yes, I think if I would have stayed at university and got a BA. Woohoo!
Nice. Now, I know that when you and I were starting out in comedy all those years ago, there was this little adage that comedians started their jokes below the waist and worked their way up. And it did kind of seem that way, that novice comedians tended to tell dirtier jokes, smuttier jokes. Why is that? Why do comedians often start below the waist?
Well, you know what? I had a lot of jokes back in the day that people that were pretty rude, pretty crude for sure. I think it's probably a place where your mind finds the easiest place to go, where you think the audience will probably laugh. Later on, I think comics aren't so worried about what the audience is thinking, so much more about what they're doing, because they're, you know, once you're more established and you're pretty confident about what you're doing, you're more interested in what you can achieve for you, regardless of the audience. Whereas I think when you start out, you're probably a bit nervous and you think, oh, well, I think these sort of jokes will get the audience going, and you want to get laughs and you don't know what's going to get laughs or what isn't. So I think people tend to go in that direction early on.
Yeah, let's talk about kind of the shocking nature of comedy. It does seem that there's an entire category of joke that essentially is somebody saying out loud things you're not supposed to say out loud. Now, those aren't necessarily those below the waist jokes, but they are absolutely shocking things that technically shouldn't be funny. Why do we find those things funny?
Well, I think we until recently we've been able to say, or people have just been saying the sort of things that a lot of people are thinking, but perhaps can't quite communicate to a group of people in a funny sort of a manner. I think the thing about comics is that, you know, the first thing a comedian does is they get up on stage. You know, that's what really separates them from everybody else. And I don't think we had in the past a real sense of right and wrong in terms. I think there was a real freedom of thought and freedom of expression and freedom of comic expression. And I also don't think the audience so much back in the day had that real moral incentive to look at what was being said and you know, act accordingly to the times. I think that back then it was genuinely, you know, people were into risk and people liked watching risque comics. And people and I would say that now you'd still get an audience who want to see quite endearing humor, or well, not endearing, risky humor, even crude or even controversial humor. I think there's a real market out there for that. Whether or not they're being exposed to it is another question, but there'll always be an audience who like comics who have a real fearless attitude towards comedy.
It's interesting you talk about the changing times. I don't know if you remember this, but I remember that Sir Howard Morrison got in a lot of trouble later in his career because he started doing jokes that, in a sense, would have been funny to an audience of his peers 20 years earlier. In particular, I think he was mocking someone with a Japanese accent, and yet it fell completely flat, as if sort of the culture had said, that's not funny anymore. We don't poke fun at Asian people for the way they speak anymore. How do comedians keep up with this kind of stuff? I mean, how do you know when you know, it's done its time?
Here's the weird thing about that. Okay, so my father, I lived in Hong Kong for a while, and my father remarried a Chinese lady, and so I can speak a little bit of Cantonese. And I remember about 2.5 years ago, I was in the Classic, and I asked the lady where she was from. She said originally Hong Kong, and I just started speaking to her in Cantonese because I know that the Hong Kong Chinese speak mainly Cantonese, as opposed to the Chinese mainlanders who mostly speak Mandarin, as opposed to the south of China. So when I started speaking to this lady in in Cantonese, this lady from who over the other side of the room stood up and went, you are a racist. This is racist, and I'm leaving. And the lady who I was talking to in Cantonese said, how is this racist? He's speaking to me in my actual, in Cantonese. He's actually speaking to me in my national tongue. It was exactly the same as if I'd met a Māori person in the crowd and I'd spoken to them in Māori and someone had not known I was speaking Māori and accused me of being racist. So firstly, you've got that. That's what makes it interesting. But the real go-to is that if you do anything about Asia or Asians, then there's that immediate, that sort of default that people go to where they go, this must immediately be racist. He's talking to a person of Asian ethnicity, so therefore it must be racist, when of course it's absolutely not. So you are dealing with situations sometimes which we are by default just immediately accusing someone of being something that perhaps they're not. And also sometimes they are. You know, I'm a big fan of accents, but I don't do many culturally different accents than anything that's white. South African, English, Scottish, and I think I'm quite good at all of them. But I won't do Chinese and I won't do Indian anymore because people just get upset.
Yeah.
And there is a couple of ways to look at that. Firstly, I don't want to upset anybody anymore. I'm too old and I want to earn some cash and I want to do corporates. But there's another way to look at it, I think, as a human being, and it's that if you're simply going by the accent and you're listening to somebody who's doing a series of white Western world accents, and then all of a sudden you immediately have a negative connotation about an accent outside that ethnicity, I think that that's a real problem. I think that if you simply hear a different accent, that it might be an Asian accent or a Māori accent, then you're immediately paralleling that with something that's negative. And I think we've got to really look at that, because I don't see anything negative about an Asian accent or a Māori accent. I think they're beautiful accents. That's the way they speak, and that's fantastic. Why do we have a negative connotation about the way that somebody else sounds? I think that having that negative connotation or pointing the finger about it and going, that's what you're actually looking at and going, oh, there is something wrong with that. No, there's not. There's not anything wrong with their accents at all. Their accents are beautiful. That's the way that they speak. And even if they're speaking English with that accent, I personally don't have a problem with them. That's just me. But other people do. Okay, so I don't do those because I don't want to upset anybody. But, having lived with a Chinese stepmom for quite a long time, and talking to her in Cantonese, the way that she speaks to me, sometimes I'll speak to her in her own accent so she understands it more like she would understand sort of a European talking at her kind of Chinese European way, if that makes any sense. But I've had so much to do with Asia. I find the whole Asian thing a little bit interesting because I'll do material in Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, Cambodia, and other Asian countries where I'll do some material about where I am in the world, and they love it and they think I've done my homework. Come to New Zealand, do the same material, someone will point the finger and call me a racist. So you've got to know what where you are and what you're saying. But I would say, and no, this is only in some cases, but when you're doing material in Asia and you come back with that material and people are calling you a racist, I think that's a problem. I think that's a real problem. It's not for but there's also, there is a line that can't be crossed. I understand that too. And that's mimicking and that kind of thing. And for me, that's sort of hack. And it's not true comedy. It's not clever comedy. But I don't think accents is something that people should really be so upset about. But they will continue to be, I'm sure.
Well, of course, now we're talking about this idea of offence going to the next level. And that is that now those who are intending to be funny, comedians around the world where countries are developing hate speech legislation, are aware that jokes are now being recategorised as hate speech, which at one level seems like an anathema, because the point of a joke is the opposite of hate. It's to make one laugh, it's to bring joy. How could a joke be hate speech?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've got to be honest, in the last sort of 4, 5, 6 years, I've changed the way that I think about comedy and do it. For example, I won't do anything that I think might, and even in saying this, it still does every now and again, but I think you could say this about any comic. but I am trying to avoid saying anything that will really upset anybody, or especially quite obviously upset them. That's not what I'm trying to achieve. I'm trying to do the comedy thing where I want people to have a good time, and I want large groups of people to have a good time. I'm 49. I don't feel I've got anything fantastically original to say to society as a person about, hey, I'm out there on the edge side of a comedian. I don't really want to say that anymore. I just want to write really good comedy and really good jokes and give everybody a really good time. And saying that, you still can sometimes tread into a place where some people might be upset, but that's been less and less of my intention as time's gone on, and I found that I'm getting far less negative kind of feedback about my material. Well, I can't speak much for the international scene because I haven't been doing it for a while. When I was doing it, especially when I was in London and the UK comedy circuit, I know that there was a real freedom with what you could do, and now I understand. And hearing from a lot of the comics who come over now, it is a lot more of a safe space environment for the audience and I guess I guess the acts. But in New Zealand, when it comes to hate speech, I would definitely have seen some comics who, on open mic nights especially, have hit it from an angle that's just so... I don't find that people get so upset by it in New Zealand anymore, as they just start talking and they go, okay, this is so ridiculous. We're not even going to boo here. We're just going to not listen. And I quite like that, where the audience has gone, yeah, okay, fine, you're going to talk about... you're going to fat shame. It's all going to be about Māori. And every now and again, you do see that. Not a lot, though. Not a lot. But when you see it happen and that's all they're doing, you can't even really work to help them, because you realise that their whole comedy act is simply based around that. Now, people who dislike me from the past will go, but all your stuff is this and that. Well, it's not, and it wasn't. I actually did very, very little that was there to offend. It's just when I did, it was regarded as very controversial. Now I would say that I specifically write about subjects which are, even for me, just difficult to write about, and take on the challenge of trying to be a smarter and better comedian. I think that if you're getting on it, I think that if you get on stage and you don't realise there are some things you just can't talk about, then comedy's probably not for you. But in saying that, you don't see it a lot. It does happen. People also freak out and they go, now, how do we stop this person from doing that? Well, what you do is they walk off stage and you go, hey, listen, if you continue to do that particular gag, I just can't book you anymore. So you don't have to cancel them as people. You don't have to cancel them even as an act. You just say, hey, if you do that particular joke, there's nothing that we can do to help you in terms of your progression as a comic. And I think that is enough for them to understand that if they want to do comedy, then they have to stop doing a certain type of material, especially people who are only doing that type of material, because it's a bad habit to get in comically anyway.
I'm wondering if what you think about the idea of whether we've become too easy to offend, because on the one hand, earlier today we were talking about racist jokes or perceived racist jokes, and they might offend people potentially with a more left-leaning sort of political bias. And on the other side, I can equally hear people from a faith community feeling like, oh, Christians get targeted in all these jokes, the comics are mean. It's kind of like everybody seems so sensitive about something.
Well, I certainly didn't used to. I used to think that we were far too sensitive about things, and I used to be one of the comics that went, "Oh, this PC thing's gone too far." I used to be like that 5-6 years ago. The thing that really changed it for me was when I actually saw some of my friends who were comedians, particularly from the gay community at first, who were being treated appallingly. I had a flatmate who I saw being treated very badly on a number of occasions, and also when I was at gigs and some of the audience members were using words that were inappropriate and made them feel very belittling kind of language towards them. So I think that really changed me, and also in terms of women in the industry, we had a couple of young girls who had a problem getting home some nights after the gigs with someone getting off a bus and following them home, and you realise that when you're making a joke about something that could directly be paralleled with one of their experiences. I just don't want to do that, and if someone wants to do it, okay. And I'm not, it's funny because if it's a good joke, even I don't know many comics who wouldn't go, okay, and even the PC brigade, whatever you described them there, they're good comics, and they're we've got obviously a lot of comics in New Zealand comedy community are quite left, but they're very good comics, and it hasn't stagnated them being really funny comics. I mean, some of the biggest names in New Zealand, especially coming up, your Mel Bracewells and your Pax Acides, and they're very conscientious left comics, but they're also blooming good. So I think it's actually quite a good thing for a comic to have had some level of PC, because it's made the comic think more about what they're doing and what they're trying to achieve, and genuinely entertaining with really good jokes. And I do believe that comedy is infinite. So even if you were to take out a couple of subjects that are just going to really upset people, you're still infinite in what you can do and what you can achieve without having to go somewhere which might really upset people, which I have done in the past. And I know I've upset people, and I don't want to do that anymore. That's my choice. I don't know if there's still really risky comics out there who still want to push that sort of narrative. And personally, I like doing as clever a gag as possible about whatever I can think of and find interesting. And, anything about race and gender these days is just not something I want to talk about.
Look, to finish today, it's really interesting because you, of course, have...
I go on. It's
good.
This lockdown, I tell you.
You've made some conscious choices to not put your career on the line over a joke, so you've decided to play within certain parameters, and that's perfectly understandable, because in that regard, you've never really been that kind of George Carlin-esque type of comedian trying to address social issues and get people to think more deeply about things. But do you fear that in a world where we're so offended and easily offended, that there might be some comics who in another era might have really got us thinking, who will just feel like it's just not worth the hassle?
Well, you could well be right. I mean, sometimes I think about what I do want to say, and those real social. George Carlin's a real exception to the rule because he was so good at it. I mean, so good at it. There aren't many George Carlins out there. In fact, there aren't any other ones. But I like that sort of thing. But I like that kind of humour. But I also think you can do that within the realms of PC, and look at somebody and I'm not actually always a fan of his politics, but I love his shows, and that's Nish Kumar, who's the most left comic I've ever seen, but he's very much pushing his ideas on people, and I really enjoy his show because I go, I don't agree with you, but that's a very funny joke. And you don't get a lot of centrists to write sort of comics. I think that those people are genuinely found. I think they probably have a bit of a tough time, because there isn't much of a centre or centre-right sort of narrative even in the world these days, let alone in comedy. But I'm sure if you want to go that way, as long as you're not being outwardly rude or I think those people who are offending are trying to. Yeah.
Right.
Does that make sense?
And that's probably where we could understand how that's getting closer to why hate speech legislation wants to kind of attack that. But I'm interested that you haven't given what I would have thought would have been the most obvious defense of the comic, which is simply, my motive is not to harm, so why are you misconstruing my words?
Well, the thing is that, even in a place of safety in my mind where I go, I'm going to do comedy like that, you're still always taking the risk. And the thing about doing comedy, which is a little bit scary for the comic, is that it is live. So every now and again, you say something and it's just been said. It was there. You can't edit it. It's been said. It's done now. And, when you are live and things aren't going great, or they're not, or you're wanting them to get better, or you're in a thing, sometimes you make the wrong decision. You can say something that, like at a dinner table when you're around family, and when you're 14, it's your first ever time with your girlfriend's family, and you say the most ridiculous thing, and you ruin the night completely, and you remember it for the rest of your life. Exactly the same with a comic, because you are live, and that can happen. I think there's a fear in that, but I've never really seen an audience go, or had the kind of complaints where it would be a problem yet. And I just don't think that if there were any comics who were doing the sort of comedy that would be considered hate speech by even centre sort of political centrists, I just don't think they'd be in the industry long enough to be able to really offend, because I think very quickly they'd be told that anything. Well, hold on. Before I go there, though, I think there is also, we've got to make sure we don't go to a place where I hate what you're saying, I hate your opinion, therefore it's hate speech. You know, we can't be in a place where we go, I disagree with his opinion, therefore I disagree with his comedy, therefore I agree with him or her, I disagree with him or her, and I think it's hate speech because I hate what they're talking about. I think we have to sort of make it very clear what is and isn't hate speech. You know, there's a lot of people's opinions I don't agree with, but and even if I hate their opinion, I don't find what they said hate speech. I just don't particularly like what they said, and I think that's fair to do that. But I don't know who draws up those rules, and I wouldn't want to be the person who did.
Well, it appears that Brendhan Lovegrove agrees that a joke should not be a crime. This is going to be an impossible world to live in, because how do you define hate speech? In fact, those who've brought in those laws have struggled with this very question, including right here in New Zealand, where a precise definition of hate speech is all but impossible to come up with. And let's be honest, we deserve to know exactly what is a crime so that we don't commit it. I know that if I'm driving 60 in a 50k zone that I've committed a crime. But hate speech turns out to be one of those laws that you only know you've broken it if the judge says you've broken it. But you didn't know you broke it, you just thought you were trying to be funny. We just need to learn to take a bit of a chill pill in this culture that seems so allergic to offence, so allergic to feeling uncomfortable. For the most part, that's all these things do, is make us feel a way we don't like to feel. But I'm sorry, we can't live in a world that promises that you'll never have to feel a certain way. Well, you can't have an episode about humour without having a little bit of humour, so we'll finish in a moment with a bit of stand-up comedy on offence by Aussie comedian Steve Hughes. But that's enough from me today. If you enjoyed the program, we'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch, activeintelligence.nz. But let's finish now with Aussie comedian Steve Hughes.
Because nothing even happens if you do get offended. It's not like you go, I went to the comedy show and the comedian said something about the Lord, yes, and I was offended. And when I woke up in the morning, I had cancer. This doesn't happen. Nothing happens. Don't let it infect you. Your heads, it's a trick, the great trick of political correctness. Acting like it's a noble intention, but it's not. It's taking away your power. You can't make it an offence to offend people. What are you talking about? You're making it an offence to offend someone. That brings the rule of law into the realm of the subjective. What's that? It's up to you how you get offended, up to your ideologies and your traditions and your cultures and your moral conditioning and your religious beliefs. And something that offends me may not offend a single one of you on any level. So how can you have a law that has any kind of rationality and validity with that kind of thinking? I'm offended when I see boy bands. Where's my lawyer? What am I going to do? Call the cops? Hello, it's me again. Yeah, they're on the telly. There's 5 of them this time.